Hi, everybody, and welcome back to our series of conversations between Caleb Maupin and Harpal Brar. This week, we're going to be talking about Korea. There's a lot to say about Korea. We'll try and focus it on a few key questions, but I'm going to open up straight away by asking Harpal to take us back really to the beginning of the modern story, which is the colonization of Korea at the beginning of the 20th century. So Harpal, do you want to start us off?
Yes, very briefly. The modern story of Korea starts really with the Sino-Japanese War of 1894. As the war between the dying Manchu dynasty and Japan. Japan won that, and as a result of that, as a result of the treaty that came at the end of that war, the Treaty of Shimonoseki, China was forced to cede Taiwan to Japan. But Taiwan was not in itself the sole aim. Eventually, it was to actually conquer Korea, which the Japanese had eyed for a very long time. Japan is bereft of natural resources. It was short of food, and Korea was very important from their point of view to be able to get their hands on Korean agriculture. But Japan was not the only country that had its eyes on Korea. As Engels said about Ireland, the misfortune of Ireland is it was situated next to a big, powerful country. And this was one of Korea's misfortunes. There were many imperialist countries in the area trying to actually grab hold of Korea. And one of the other countries was, of course, the United States. And then there was the Russian Tsarist Empire. And eventually, the Japanese were not able to find any way of getting their hands on Korea except by making sure that the Russians won't do that. And that is where they started the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. It was a war that ended in the victory of Japan. It was a shock to the world at many levels. One, it was unheard of that an Asian country would defeat a powerful European country like Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia may have been backward, but it was a very powerful country. And it was a shock. And it was to be actually become the prelude to the 1905-1907 Russian Revolution, about which both of you know very much, and probably our audiences do as well. But anyway, sticking ourselves to Japan, after the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese then laid their hands on Korea, and that happened in the year 1910. And within a few years, they turned it into a complete colony, and they used its materials, its agriculture, for the purpose of feeding the Japanese population. Japan was industrializing, and it was very short of food, and therefore they needed food, and they got it from Korea. But of course, this didn't really settle the whole thing, because as soon as that happened, the Koreans resisted that occupation, and it led to a considerable amount of loss of life that the Koreans suffered as a result of that. And then, of course, the Americans were after Korea as well. And the one way they settled was that the Americans agreed, at least at that time, that yes, the Japanese could have Korea, provided that the Japanese would recognize that the Americans had the right to rule over the Philippines. And that was a settlement whereby the Americans were not liberators of Koreans or anything. They were actually the oppressors who were prepared to make a sacrifice for Korea in order that they could continue to have their mitts on Philippines, which they had conquered along with Cuba after the American-Cuban War. And of course, that was an area in Asia that was close to Japan, and there was a danger that the Japanese would attack it. And the Americans were worried about it, and therefore they came to an agreement with them. That's how the conquest of Korea starts, and it carries on for another 35 years.
Thank you. Caleb.
Oh, well, that's a lot of very interesting history that I was not completely aware of. I do know that there is a kind of a blank spot on the part of a lot of us when we think about Japan. We just, in the West, we just think of Japan as a country in Asia. But to a lot of people in Asia and the Pacific, Japan is a colonizer. Japan is an imperialist country. Japan is a brutal country that has engaged in all kinds of horrendous crimes against the people of Korea, against the people of China, against the people of the Philippines and elsewhere. And that's one thing that we kind of gloss over. When I talk to folks from Asia, often, I mean, the understanding of the horrendous crimes of Japanese imperialism is something that people are very aware of in Asia, but we in the West kind of gloss over and forget.
It's very interesting you point to that, Caleb, because even today in Korea, despite the fact of the terrible crimes that have been committed against the Korean people by US imperialism, from what I understand from comrades who work in South Korea, the popular sentiment is still most strongly anti-Japanese than it is anti-American, precisely because those crimes are so committed over a long period, so deep in the psyche, and still not sort of accounted for or atoned for or accepted, acknowledged. It's still a living wound in the Korean people's memory. Some of the crimes of Japanese imperialism in Korea, and the fact that the US requirement is for all of this to be swept under the carpet because they want a new alliance in that part of the world between the USA, South Korea, and Japan, and they want the Koreans to forget about their animosity to the Japanese, and they're finding there's a lot of resistance to that.
Yeah.
Well, when the Japanese came to Korea, they were trying to portray themselves as industrializers of Korea. They would industrialize Korea, and it would lead to a tremendous amount of prosperity. It didn't actually, because the Korean people were working something like 14 hours a day, and they were being actually exhausted to death as a result of long working hours. And then Japan took quite a lot of laborers from Korea into Japan, and some of their descendants continue to live there, and usually are treated as second-class citizens. And there's been a movement in Japan against their treatment in Japan, and that's a story by itself. Then, of course, the Koreans remember that very much, because the Japanese actually forced close to 300,000 Japanese women into sex slavery. They were called comfort women.
Right.
Comfort for whom? Comfort not for the women who were raped and subjected to forcible sexual slavery. It was comfort for the Japanese soldiery. And the question still rankles with the Koreans. It's a constant bone of contention, not only between the DPRK and Japan, but also between the Japanese and the puppet state that is South Korea. South Korea is not an independent sovereign country. South Korea is an occupied country, occupied by the US ever since 1945. Before that by the Japanese, and now by the Americans. The only part of Korea that is genuinely sovereign, that is free, and free from occupation, that is the DPRK. Although the story we will hear is completely different in the West, that North Korea is run by a brutal dictatorship. It's a family, it's a dynasty, but they don't look at the achievements of the DPRK. Even somebody like Joan Robinson, who visited the DPRK in the early 60s, said North Korea was a paradise. That it's her expression, not mine. It was a paradise. And how really a level of equality had been achieved. Because what the Japanese did was that they just patronized few landowning families in Korea. They left the average peasant devoid of land, devoid of a means of earning a living. And so they recruited people who were their flunkies. They were, of course, treated as second-class slaves, but much better than the ordinary people. And these are the people who would continue for a long time to serve imperialism, and that is true right up to today. Their descendants. I mean, the only ones who didn't manage to do that were those who were in the DPRK.
It's very noticeable, isn't it, that even right through the period of the Republic of Korea in the south, i.e. the puppet state under occupation by US imperialism, has been run by a few families who are like a mafia, and they pass the title of leader between them. You know, if you have a few families who are the leadership, that's not a dictatorship. But if you have close relationships between your leaders who come after each other, that's definitely a dictatorship. You know, they have a funny way of defining these things. I just wanted, before we come on to Korea's liberation struggle, I just wanted to make a small point that jumps out at me when I listen to and think about the early colonial history of Korea and its relationship with Japan, and that is the relationship between Britain and Ireland during our Industrial Revolution. Right? You see exactly the same picture. You see Britain is rapidly developing its industrial base, its cities are growing, its industrial population is growing, it needs to feed those people. Ireland is the place just next door, very handily situated to provide food for the industrial population of Britain. It also provides second-class citizens, second-class labor, very, very cheap labor. They come over here. Marx wrote about it and Engels in great detail about how it was the secret of the weakness of the British working class that they allowed this to be in their midst, and they looked down on the Irish workers and allowed the ruling class to divide the working class in this way, and that made them in fact impotent against their class enemies because that was allowed to continue. But that relationship between, you know, the industrial colonizer and the colonized kind of agrarian state just next door, country, colony, whatever, is exactly kind of similar, isn't it? So anyway, Dad, let's come on to the question of the liberation struggle. So you've talked, I mean, right from the word go, there was a strong liberation movement in Korea once the Japanese occupation had been established in 1910. It's taken different forms at different times. And of course, as you mentioned, the North has achieved its liberation while the South is still a colony to this day, you know, 100 and, you know, nearly 15 years after that colonization by Japan. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about Korea's liberation struggle? Well,
the Korean patriots struggled right from day one against the occupation, but the story of real resistance exacerbates with the emergence of, at that time, very young Kim Il-sung as a fighter for liberation. And one way of doing those days was that the Korean liberation fighters went across the border. They went into Manchuria, and they fought along with their Chinese comrades against Japanese imperialism, which had started conquering China as well. There's a tremendous amount of help that the Koreans rendered the Chinese Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution rendered to the Koreans, and they fought as comrades, and then of course the Japanese conquered Manchuria, and they established a puppet state called Manchukuo, the state of the Manchus. It was not an independent state, although nominally it was headed by local Chinese, but they were all puppets in the hands of the Japanese. And with the help of the Manchukuo state, they tried to suppress the liberation struggle of the Chinese as well as of the Koreans. And Kim Il-sung had become a legendary fighter for liberation, a guerrilla fighter, and the Japanese spent a lot of resources, men and material, in order to capture him. They were not successful. And they recruited, of course, the Korean traitors, some of whom would later become very important in the so-called Republic of Korea. They were into hunting Kim Il-sung. But then what happens, of course, is that the Japanese, because of their contradictions with US imperialism, were in a terrible state, because Japan, being bereft of natural resources, particularly bereft of tin, rubber, and especially oil, which were of course controlled either by the British or by the Americans. And President Roosevelt, in order to put pressure on Japan, had cut off oil supplies to Japan, which was actually the main reason for the Japanese deciding that either they had to submit to US imperialism or gamble on attacking America. And that's when they attacked Pearl Harbor and destroyed the American Pacific Fleet, which was stationed in Pearl Harbor. So that's what brought America into the war, not actually the desire to fight against the Nazis for liberation of people from fascism, but because they'd been attacked by Japan. And once that had happened, then there's a Pacific War between the United States and Japan. But eventually, by the time that the Second World War is coming to an end in the West, there is a conference between the US, USSR, and Britain, and it was discussed at the Yalta Conference as to what will happen to the Japanese in Korea and in China, etc. And as far as Korea was concerned, there was an agreement that 3 months after the end of the war in the West, the USSR will enter the war against Japan, with which it had a treaty of neutrality, would enter the war against Japan along with Western powers. And that is precisely what happened. After the war ended, 3 months after that, I believe it was on the 8th of August 1945, that the USSR entered this war, and the Red Army literally swept through Manchuria, defeating the Japanese, and carried on all the way to Korea. By that time, you have to remember, the Americans had already exploded 2 bombs on Japan. Japan was ready to surrender, but these bombs were simply dropped for the reasons that we've discussed before in this program. So both the American forces and the Red Army headed into Korea, and as had been agreed, I believe at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet forces occupied north of the 38th parallel and the Americans south of the 38th parallel. And the agreement was that there would be an attempt to let the Korean people in each region sort out their own affairs, form their own government. Because as the Japanese are defeated, the Koreans are setting up people's committees both in the north and south of the country. And the south of the country was not really under the control of Americans, because the overwhelming sentiment of the population was with what Kim Il-sung was proposing. And so the agreement was that after 5 years, both the Red Army and the American forces would leave, and the Koreans would hold a nationwide election, and whichever government came to power, that would be had the new republic of Korea. There'll be the new state. Well, what happened was, after 3 years, in the northern zone, the Soviet Union didn't interfere with what the Korean patriots were doing, what Kim Il-sung was doing. They were setting up people's committees. They were involved in land reforms. Land was given to the peasantry. This was the millennium-old desire of the peasantry to acquire land, and they had never got it. They were given land, and anybody who had more than 12 acres could not keep that. So the landlords who ruled both in the north and the south were deprived of their land in the northern part of the Korean peninsula. But they were also given, if they wanted to cultivate, 12 acres of land, as long as it was not in the same county from which they hailed, because otherwise they'd exercise undue influence over their former tenants. So land reform was instituted, and people's lives were made better. Laws were passed like working only 8 hours a day as opposed to 13, 14 under the Japanese. And if the work was of a hazardous nature, it was 7 hours a day. They were given 2 weeks of paid holiday. But if they were working in hazardous industries, it was 4 weeks paid holiday every year. There were kindergarten, creche, schooling. Life was generally improved for the people in the north, but nothing of the kind was happening. Anyway, after having created a space, not interfering in internal affairs, it was the Koreans under Kim Il-sung who were doing everything in the north. The Soviet forces left at the end of 1948. The Americans did not leave, and they're still there today. They have the biggest base right in the center of Seoul. No other country has an American base in the middle of its capital, but the Americans have in South Korea this independent, sovereign country that we are told, but it's actually an occupied country, and it does everything, not even if its reactionary ruling class doesn't want that. It actually is forced to do that which the Americans want, and they are being used constantly as a source of troublemaking on the borderline between the DPRK and South Korea. It's not a borderline which is internationally recognized. It's not a borderline between two countries. It's a forcible division of one country imposed by the Americans. And it is the sincere desire and wish of the Korean people to have their country united and to be rid of foreign occupation, which they have had for so long, particularly since 1910.
Thank you, Harpal. Caleb.
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, that was a lot of ground that was covered. 1919, I know there was an event in Korea called the White Robe Movement, and it was a kind of religious pacifist protest movement against Japanese occupation. And it was met with brutal repressive violence. Not only did they shoot down the protesters who were marching against Japanese, colonialism, but on top of that, I understand that in retaliation for these widespread peaceful protests against the Japanese occupiers, they went and lit some schools on fire and killed a whole bunch of innocent Korean children that had nothing to do with the protests or anything, just to retaliate. And that was a moment where a lot of Korean folks that were involved in opposing Japanese colonialism, became more involved in the kind of the radical communist circles, because it was understood that there just would not be room for any other form of dissent to Japanese occupation. The other thing that I think I actually just wanted to ask Harpal about is, I think it's really important to talk about. It's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and this is it's a people's democracy, right? That was the formula that after the Second World War across Eastern Europe, these governments would come into power that were kind of a coalition of anti-fascist parties and forces. I know on the Korean Peninsula, the Korean Workers' Party is a merger of different political parties that were opposing Japan during the Second World War, in Romania and Czechoslovakia and East Germany and many places like that. It was kind of the People's Democratic form of government, this was kind of an innovation that I think came from Stalin largely. Of how you could form kind of an anti-fascist coalition government with communists at the center of it. And the DPRK is an example of that. China, is an example of that. So I was hoping that maybe Harpal could talk about the people's democracy form of government.
Well, it literally means that after the overthrow of feudalism and after the overthrow of foreign imperialism, the government that would come would not straight away be able to implement socialism, but it will institute democracy. But it would not be the old kind of bourgeois democracy. It would be people's democracy led by the communists, and workers' parties, and that's what the Koreans did. That's why they called their republic the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And even when they move on to the higher stage, the name, of course, does not change any more than it has changed in the case of China. But at that time, they had to sort out various problems which were really at the democratic stage. And the most important of the democratic reforms was not just only get rid of foreign occupation, but also giving land to the peasantry. That was the most important democratic demand. That is precisely why it was democratic. It was the demand of the majority of the people. It was the demand of the peasantry, which was the majority of the population. So for the first time, the peasantry received land free of charge. They didn't have to pay for it. They didn't have to buy it. They didn't have to pay any land revenue. They didn't have to pay any money as tenants. In the old Korea, anywhere between 50 to 80% of the produce was handed over by the peasants to the landlords. But now you can see the freedom that people would enjoy once that happened. I come from a country where there was a large peasantry, and you can see the joy in the eyes of a peasant if he acquires land free of charge. Of course, he hasn't done so in India, but that is what happened in countries like Russia first, China, northern part of Korea. So that was a reform. Among the other democratic reforms, like making education available to ordinary people rather than being the remit of only the privileged classes, making sure that men and women could participate equally in productive and political activity. This could only happen by creating the facilities that would allow women. You can pass a law that women are equal. That can be done on the very first day of a progressive government coming into being. But that does not bring equality to women, because the subjugation of women lies in the fact that they are chained to the household, that they are chained to the nursery, chained to the kitchen. And so you have to create facilities by creating cheap facilities for cheap meals, by creating facilities for kids to be looked after during work, etc., for there to be educational facilities. And that is really what was done. And that was definitely a case of democratic reform, which the Koreans put into effect very, very quickly indeed, far more than you would expect considering the conditions in which they found themselves in 1945.
Yeah, well, I have here, this is from the Kim Il-sung's works, the 20-point platform, that the DPRK came to power on, from the radio address, March 23rd, 1946. And I've often referred to this when I've talked to people about revolutions and united fronts, because the 20-point platform of the People's Korea, I mean, you read it, they're not, the demands in and of themselves, they don't sound like the most radical thing. I mean, you listen to what they were for, they're almost like, how could you disagree? But at the end of the day, they're reforms that do, they're not reforms. They do cut at the heart of the society as it previously existed. I mean, it's just 20 points. I'll read them really quickly. thoroughly liquidate all remnants of Japanese imperialist rule, wage an implacable struggle against reactionary and anti-democratic elements, grant entire freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. See that the Korean people have the right to form their own people's committees. Grant equal rights to all citizens in politics, regardless of sex, religion, or property status. Abolish all laws and judicial organs which were remnants of Japanese imperialism. Develop industry, agriculture, transport, and trade for the enhancement of the people's welfare. Nationalize and encourage free activity in private handicrafts and trade. Confiscate all land belonging to the Japanese state, the Japanese traders and landlords who fix the market prices for living necessities to combat speculators and usurers. Institute a system of uniform, equitable taxation and progressive income tax. Introduce an 8-hour working day for factory workers. Institute life insurance for factory and office workers. Introduce a system of universal compulsory education and widely increase primary and secondary school and colleges run by the state. Actively develop national culture, science, and the arts. Set up special schools on a wide scale for the training of personnel to be involved in state organs and in fields of national economy. Encourage scientists and artists in their work and give them assistance. And the last one is increase the number of state-run hospitals and stamp out epidemics and provide free medical care to the poor. That's the 20-point platform the DPRK took power on. And, you know, if you think about it, that's that in and of itself. Like if you were a person on the Korean Peninsula, who would be against such things, right? It's not like the most radical platform. It's not something that people have to completely change their whole worldview. But it's something that only the communists in power, only a Marxist-Leninist party in power could actually deliver. And I feel like that's the kind of thing, is they positioned themselves at the center of a coalition, and they were able, with their understanding of Marxism, to give leadership to a movement that wanted what all the Korean people in their bones wanted. So that I often will refer to that 20-point program.
I mean, what you have read, the 20-point program, Caleb, is a thoroughly democratic program, but long past other days when this program of democracy could be delivered by the bourgeoisie. The last bourgeois country that was to deliver that was probably France. And in our own times, to a certain extent, I think my old friend Mugabe delivered it in Zimbabwe. You know, a lot of things, land reform, etc., bringing education, and bringing some health clinics, etc. Now, after the French Revolution, soon after that, the bourgeoisie realized that it's not very good to attack private rights, even if they belong to feudal classes, because it's very infectious. The next class that is waiting in queue says, what about us? And they'd say, well, let's nationalize industry. Let's do this, that, the other. Let's organize production slightly differently from the way it is done. So, I mean, there were people, bourgeois economists, like in your own country, Henry George, who were in favor of nationalization of land in America. But it didn't take place because the American ruling class understood that once you nationalize land, you're creating an infectious precedent where people would want the same with industry and everything else. So that's why the democratic revolution in our times can only be really successful if it's led by the party of the proletariat. No other party, no other leadership can deliver that to the people. You can look all around the map. You can look at the map, and you will find that this is the case.
Thanks, Harpal. I think we should try and move on a little bit and talk about the war, because obviously very few years after the liberation, so-called, of Korea from Japanese imperialism, as you said, Harpal, the Soviet Red Army came as liberators. They didn't interfere in what the Korean people chose, how they chose to organize themselves and organize their lives. And they left in 1948. The forces who came supposedly as liberators in the South, the US imperialists, they came as occupiers right from the beginning. influencing and controlling and micromanaging the life of the people of South Korea, who weren't able to express their will in the way the people of the North were. And very quickly, a new war broke out. So, they've been fighting for their liberation for decades. They finally, in the North at least, feel like they're achieving it. In the South, they haven't yet. But then there's a whole new war against those who have achieved liberation so quickly after they're fully independent. In the West, they just call it the Korean War. The people of the DPRK call it the Fatherland Liberation War. 3 years of incredibly grueling, barbaric warfare waged against the people of Korea. 4 million, I think, people died in that war. The country was absolutely ravaged. The USA boasted that they bombed Pyongyang back to the Stone Age. It would take them 1,000 years to rise again. They're really proud of these genocidal achievements against a people who had had the temerity to just want to live their lives according to their own will and use their resources, as they saw fit. Harpal, do you want to talk to us a bit about that?
Well, it's basically the question, really. There were two systems which were fighting for hegemony over the Korean Peninsula. One was US imperialism with the help of its flunkies in Korea. The flunkies were all former agents of Japanese imperialism, agents of Japanese occupation. And they, of course, as soon as the Japanese had been defeated, they transferred their loyalties, willingly or otherwise, to the new rulers, that is to the Americans. They wanted to keep the same old system of exploitation of the vast majority of the people by a tiny minority. On the other hand, you've got a revolutionary example in the northern part of the country, where people's committees are working well, and after the Americans had gone back on all the agreements that they had signed with the Soviet Union, that they would leave and the people could decide their own future. They actually formed a government in the southern part of the country and called it Republic of Korea. It was only after that that the people's committees in the north met and formed their own government, and that became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But of course, they couldn't live for too long without any conflict, because the Americans were there to make sure that the whole of Korea is really very important, not only for itself, of course it is an important country, but it occupies such an important position on the borders of Soviet Union, the borders of China, and the Americans obviously had every idea of turning Korea into a base for rolling back the tide of revolution in China, the tide of revolution in the USSR, etc. So they couldn't tolerate the existence of the northern part, which was very much allied to the socialist camp, which was very much allied to the Soviet Union, and for one reason or the other, they wanted to create problems as far as the Korean War is concerned. The Americans, the Imperialists and their flunkies, and the South Korean puppets all say North Korea started by going over the border across the 38th parallel. There are 2 points I want to make. First of all, the DPRK says, no, it's the South Korean puppets acted on by US imperialism who did that. Personally, if I have to make a choice who to believe, I believe the DPRK, because DPRK has a long history of telling the truth. They're not in the business of telling lies. Secondly, even if the DPRK forces were the first to cross, where were they going? They were going into their own country. The 38th parallel is not an internationally recognized boundary between two countries. It's a temporary line drawn for the two different regions of Korea. There's one thing on which the DPRK revolutionary leadership and the Korean puppets agree is that there is one Korea. The South Koreans claim the right to occupy the northern part of the country. They say it's an illegitimate regime. And the North Koreans say just the opposite. So if they were going across the boundary, they were going into their own country, who were they committing aggression? It's like really claiming that when Lincoln's forces crossed into the territory of the Confederates, they were committing aggression against another country. Now, if you said that, you'd be laughed in your face, including by US imperialism. What are you talking about? It was a civil war in our own country. And that's precisely what was happening in Korea. So they were not actually crossing a boundary. They went there. Now, in my view, the South Korean puppets thought they'd have an easy run. They decided to attack the North. The Northern forces swept through the South, and within 3 days, they'd occupied Seoul. And within about 2.5 months, they'd liberated about over 90% of the southern part of the country, and they would have been defeated in no time. And it is at that time that the American forces entered Korea. They got a resolution passed at the United Nations, which was an illegal resolution because it required the unanimous vote of all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council for the Americans to send their forces. But they didn't have the Soviet representative present at the time because the Soviet Union was boycotting the meetings of the Security Council, because Security Council representative for China, permanent representative, was Chiang Kai-shek's government when they controlled nothing but for Taiwan, thanks to US imperialism giving them support at the end of the Chinese liberation struggle, when Chiang Kai-shek's forces ran to Taiwan, and they were representing China, and the Soviets were obviously protesting against that. The Soviet representative was not present. So the Americans said, well, there had to be a positively negative vote cast for the Security Council to have blocked it. And they took it to the United Nations General Assembly, which at that time was dominated by the Americans, and got some resolution passed to send forces. So the Americans, who pushed every one of their flunkies to wage that war, turn around and say, it's a war that is conducted by the United Nations, and they're sending their forces only in support of the United Nations. But nothing could be more of a travesty of truth than that. And the Americans then thought, well, they'll have an easy time. And once they went in, they then pushed across the 38th parallel and came into North Korea, occupied large parts of it. And then as they were approaching Yalu River, which is a boundary between Korea and China, the Chinese had already said, if you come near Chinese territory, we will enter the war. And that's what happened. The Chinese, Mao Zedong sent the People's Volunteers into Korea to fight on behalf of the Korean people against US imperialism. And within a few months, the combined forces of the DPRK, the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteers had pushed the Americans over the 38th parallel. And it was at that time that in his desperation, General MacArthur, who was in charge of, who was the head of the American forces, asked President Truman if he could use just about 50 nuclear weapons. And Truman said, no, it couldn't be done. Not because Truman was a lover of peace. He was the same person who had allowed 2 bombs to be dropped on Japan, because by that time, the Soviet Union had also acquired nuclear weapons, and there was a danger of a war with the Soviet Union. And so, really, the war should have ended once the Americans were pushed back to beyond the south of 38th parallel. But the war carried on for another 2 years, during which time the Americans continued to bomb the northern part of the country, as well as parts of the south, because the people of south were not enamored of what the US and its puppets were doing. They were also rising in rebellion. And during the same time that they're fighting against the DPRK and the People's Volunteers, they're also fighting against their own people. They killed hundreds of thousands of the people in the south of the country. In the end, having realized they couldn't carry on anymore, an armistice was signed in 1952, and that's how the Korean War didn't end. A truce was signed. Technically speaking, the US imperialists and their puppets are still at war with the DPRK. They've just taken a long break from that fight, if you like. And that war was the first war that the Americans lost. There was no war before that the Americans took part in it, which did not conclude with a treaty which declared the Americans to be winners, but they did not win. There was a hard lesson they had to learn. You can see why they have such burning hatred for the DPRK, why they have such a burning hatred for China. Japan is almost painted as a kind of, in the style of Buddha, peace-loving, he brings peace everywhere. The Japanese are brutal conquerors. You know, in Nanking alone, within a few days, they had killed 300,000 Chinese. In DPRK, if you go there, the Korean comrades will take you to various places where the Americans bombed within a week and killed 25,000 people. I've been to one of the museums, I believe it's in Sinchon County, my memory is not that good, where you were shown the kind of cruelties the Americans were committing. At one place, there were women, Korean women incarcerated, and they were with their children, and in order to entertain their children, they were singing songs, and the Americans had gasoline poured over that encampment and set it on fire. They were absolutely cruel. They were even more cruel than the Japanese, and yet the story is American and British are peace-loving democrats. It's always the Germans in Europe, and it's always the Japanese in Asia who committed atrocities. But nobody can exceed the atrocities committed by Anglo-American imperialism. They really are monsters of the worst kind.
Too true, Caleb.
Well, I think it's also worth pointing out that one of the main reasons that the war broke out was that originally there was supposed to be a peninsula-wide election of a constituent assembly where every political party and every part of the Korean Peninsula would be free to elect delegates to write a unified constitution. But in the South, they would not allow the Korean Workers' Party to be part of the writing of this new constitution. And that when the workers on Jeju Island rose up demanding their democratic rights, demanding the right to vote for the communists and to participate in the elections, that they were brutally slaughtered and that there was a brutal massacres of Korean workers in the South who were demanding their democratic rights and calling for the entire peninsula to have a free and fair election where the communists would be allowed to participate. And because the communists weren't able to join a coalition government, and then those who did call for such a thing were being slaughtered, it makes sense that in the context of that, the folks in the North would feel an obligation to protect their Southern country folk. I mean, and this way it's always presented, as you pointed out. The way it's always presented is North Korea attacked South Korea. And it's like, you have to remember, this is one country, right? So that's the way we're always, North Korea attacked South Korea. That's just the way Americans have been taught to think about things. It's like we've been taught that there's this big, evil, scary place called North Korea. And so this big, scary place called North Korea attacked South Korea. It's like, no, this was one country that had been divided in the aftermath of the Second World War, which was very recent, was like 1 or 2 years prior to this. And everything that we're told about why the Korean War broke out is just covered up. The other thing is that there is a documentary that I believe was shown on BBC in the United Kingdom called The Unknown War that goes into great detail about the atrocities committed by the United States on the Korean Peninsula. They wouldn't show it on American television. They said American audiences couldn't handle it, and that the American public has largely just hidden the horrendous crimes that were committed by the United States against the Korean people. I mean, the details, and I mean, the use of the bombing of the dikes to create flooding, and the torture of prisoners, and just, I mean, the horrendous atrocities that were committed during the Korean War by U.S. forces. I mean, the world knows about it, but the American public doesn't know about it and hasn't come to terms with it. The other thing that I find to be beautiful and inspiring is that I remember when I was first, when I was like a teenager, first getting involved in communist politics, there was an older woman who had been in the Communist Party USA. And she remembered when she was very young, the protest movement against the Korean War. People know about the protests against the Vietnam War, but in the United States, there were some isolated protests against the Korean War. The Communist Party was basically illegal at this point. It was functioning underground because of McCarthyism. But, she was a nurse and, she was working as a nurse at a hospital. And she told us the story of someone came to her and said, at Times Square in New York City at this time, there's going to be a protest. So just be there, and, kind of gave her a message. And she and other people, they gathered in Times Square, and people were wearing suits and ties and just kind of standing around. And then someone shouted a code word, and then they unfurled a very big banner that said, peace on the U.S. troops out of the Korean Peninsula. And immediately the police came down on them and started beating them. So they split apart, and then they reconvened at 34th Street at Madison Square. And again, they waited until someone shouted a code word, and then they unfurled their banner, and then the police came down on them, and they did this all through Manhattan. And they were functioning as almost an underground organization. A lot of their members were beaten up and arrested, and they could barely have this protest against the Korean War. The other thing is that the writer Howard Fast, who was at that point a member of the Communist Party, in order to support the Korean people, he rented a hotel room facing Times Square in New York City, and he got big speakers. And they blasted out anti-imperialist messages into Times Square, over big speakers. And the police were scrambling, trying to figure out where it was coming from, trying to figure out what hotel room was blasting this out. And that this was how the Communist Party USA had to function. But they understood that they had to show solidarity with their Korean comrades. And even though they were functioning as a basically illegal underground organization amid McCarthyism, they still managed to protest the Korean War. And that as the Korean War went on, there was increasing dissension among the U.S. soldiers. I mean, the U.S. military, even they had just had the Second World War, and there were a number of U.S. soldiers who didn't want to be there. And part of the reason the USA ultimately signed the armistice and pulled its forces back and went back to the 38th parallel was because within the U.S. military there was increasing dissension. To this day, North Korea is the only country in the world that has ever captured a U.S. Army general. Now, there have been other generals that have been captured by different countries, generals of the Marine Corps, admirals in the Navy, but the only country that's ever captured a U.S. Army general is North Korea. And I actually have read the autobiography of that general, and it's fascinating. He speaks very glowingly. He says that he learned a lot from his Korean captors. And he talks about how they made very good points about how in capitalism, labor unions try to fight against automation because, technological advancement leads to greater poverty. And this was a very good point that was made. And he talks about what it was like to be held as a prisoner of war, and how they made a big point of trying to teach him Marxism, and how he actually learned a lot about Marxism from his captors. So that whole story is important. And it's important to know that, in the United States, we think of the Korean War as just ancient history. It's not ancient history on the Korean Peninsula by any means. It is considered to be a very, very relevant current event. They all know that history, and they are locked and loaded, sun gun, military first. They are ready. If the Americans come again, they will fight them on every mountain and every village and every rock. They know what happened, and they know why they had big problems in the 1990s due to the sanctions and the arduous March period. And the Korean people know their history very, very well, and they're ready to have another Korean War if they have to. And that's why the U.S. imperialists, are at this point. I mean, that's why they haven't invaded. They would like to have invaded them. They were the axis of evil with Bush. They've had troops on the Korean Peninsula, but they know. I mean, they have done military assessment with their satellites. They know that a fight on the Korean Peninsula would not be a war they could very easily win.
You bring us to a really important point there, Caleb. But just before I come back to it, can you remember the name of that general whose book you were talking about?
I think, it's William F. Dean, and I will just stand up. His book is right over here.
I think it's Dean.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just writing that down. everyone who's listening, you've got a moment to write.
William F. Dean. This is his autobiography of how he was held, by the North Koreans.
Story.
William F. Dean. Yeah.
That sounds like a book worth reading. These are the ways to get your history, people.
Yeah.
From people who were there and who've seen something that's worth knowing about. Coming back to this question about the North Korean, the people of North Korea, their preparedness for war, we again have to come right back to the question of the armistice, right? Since 1953, they have lived in a situation where there is a truce, but not a negotiated peace. They have performed all of the miracles that they have performed in their country to rebuild the country that had been so destroyed by US bombing that the US was bragging it would take them 1,000 years. It didn't at all. They've built Pyongyang in particular into a beautiful city, but they've reconstructed their entire country, their industry, their agriculture, all of their state services, hospitals, schools, all the rest of it. They've done that not only with the constant threat of war hanging over them, and so preparing to defend their country against further imperialist attack has been at the core of everything they've had to do. And yet they've made all of these achievements. At the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, they had the terrible situation of finding that their main trading partner in the world was gone, and they were underneath a tremendously strangulating economic blockade from the West. And yet they held on to their socialism and continued to find ways to build and continue to develop their self-defense machinery, to the point where now the USA is actually terrified about the military capabilities of North Korea, that at the same time as building a socialist society, socialist industry, socialist agriculture, schools, children's palaces, all the achievements that the Korean people have, they have been able to develop the technology to compete with and defeat imperialist armies of aggression. And that's a very tremendous thing. And we don't hear enough about what it really means that they can do that. The people know how to fight, they know how to use weapons. And that means that they're able to mobilize a humongous army if they have to. They prefer not to, but they're ready if they have to. And they have weapons now that mean that the threat of nuclear war goes two ways. They now have, the ability to take their weapons all the way over to the US mainland, which completely changes the dynamic between the two powers. When the US is threatening, the DPRK can stand its ground and say, anything you can do to us, we can do to you. And in fact, they're starting to develop weapons that the USA doesn't have, right? They have those hypersonic missiles that Russia and China also have, and the US, Britain, the imperialist countries don't have. So they've really built this defensive capability, which is so important. And that, of course, is why they're constantly screamed about as being aggressive, right? But I remember talking to a lady from Korea years ago, asking, she had lived for various reasons in many countries in the world. And I said to her, well, which was your favorite? And she said, North Korea. And I said, oh, why is that? You've seen a lot of places. She said, my country is so peaceful. The atmosphere in which people live is calm, is civilized, is humane. And so she says when she goes home, she always felt that sense of inner peace, being somewhere so peaceful. And yet that inner peace that they have provided for their people is provided, there's a kind of contradiction, is provided in this circumstance of the constant threat of war hangs over them. And when you look at the war games that are going on in South Korea right now, the imperialists are ratcheting up the tensions to a hysterical level and constantly rehearsing the invasion and nuclear attack against and decapitation of the leaders of North Korea. And every time they mobilize these humongous joint exercises, the DPRK has to put itself on a war footing because it might turn into a real one, Harpal.
Well, before I comment on what you said, Joti, I just want to say the difference between the two systems can be gauged from the fact that after their liberation, in the northern part, the DPRK created thousands of schools, hospitals, and factories that produced for the working people of Korea. And during the American war against the north of the country, they destroyed over 7,000 factories, over 6,000 schools, over 1,000 hospitals, among others. You know, it's a country that has sacrificed so much to build these. And the American achievement, and they boast about it shamelessly, is that we didn't leave anything standing there. We bombed them. And it's to the credit, in fact, the glory of the DPRK, that after that devastating and destructive war, they were able to build all that, and they provide education to their kids that is not available in the so-called free south of the country. They provide health facilities to their people which are not available even in the United States. They provide kindergartens and creche and facilities for looking after children. If you go to a North Korean school, kids are cultured. They're not singing yob rubbish. They're singing beautiful songs. They're cultured. Everybody can play some instrument. Almost everybody can actually sing. I think I was born in North Korea. Even I could probably learn to sing. And it's always true of the socialist countries. That's what they do. They look after the welfare of the people. And that's why they're hated. But why are they hated? Because they look after the people. Because the system, imperialism, is a man-hating. I use it in the way human beings are. It's a man-hating system. It's a man-eating system. Human beings mean nothing to them. All that matters is making profit and maximum profit at any given time. And the difference is that whereas the Korean people fought for their liberation, as soon as the imperialist forces defeat their rivals like Japan, in Germany, in the West, although Germany was defeated mainly by the Red Army, or the Japanese defeated in Indochina, first thing they do is they mobilize the defeated countries' armies in order to suppress the local population. This happens in Vietnam, that happens in Indonesia, where the British and the French forces land, and what do? They restore the old regime and start fighting against the very people who have fought against Japanese imperialism. The same thing they did do in Korea. All the traitors. Have you heard of a South Korean president, Park Chung-hee? He was a South Korean agent of Japanese imperialism. But of course, once Japan was defeated, all these people were enlisted into the South Korean puppet army and the South Korean national police, which they used to terrorize their own people, kill people by the hundreds of thousands, imprison people who went to jail for basically praising the northern part of the country, spent 20, 30 years in jail for no other reason that they actually violated the so-called national security law, which says you cannot actually praise North Korea. You cannot have any dealings with North Koreans. Why not? They are their brethren. Why can't they have dealings with the North Korean? But that's precisely what they did. And to the extent there is any industrial development, it's helped by the US, both in Japan as well as Korea, because it was clear after the Second World War, communism was very popular. If countries were left to themselves, several countries in the world would have gone communist, including Japan, including France, and of course Korea. There's no question about it. China did go communist. North Korea did go. It was such an allurement because the communist program is such, it appeals to ordinary people. Which ordinary peasant doesn't want land? Which ordinary worker does not want education for his children? Which woman working in a factory does not want a creche or a kindergarten? The program that was put forward by the communists, by the revolutionary governments, was so alluring that America could not trust people to have a vote. Their idea was to change the electorate, but they couldn't change the electorate in the circumstances, so they had to suppress everything, and they did that at tremendous human cost. So millions of Koreans had to pay with their lives, as indeed the Vietnamese, as indeed the Indonesians, to finally actually free themselves from the tutelage of American imperialism. And in some cases, they're not free. Like in the southern part of Korea, they're still occupied by the US. And the US keeps on saying every time, oh, North Koreans are aggressive. Why? They're aggressive because they're developing nuclear weapons. Now, they tried for years to come to an agreement with America that they won't develop nuclear weapons, provided, because they were short of electricity, they were short of these resources, and the Americans would help them with oil supplies as well as nuclear power, which would not be capable of producing nuclear weapons. But the Americans reneged on every agreement that they signed. So what do you expect the North Koreans to do? They had to then take no for an answer and get on with developing the weapons of self-defense. The main thing is they can keep on calling North Korea aggressive. Which country has North Korea invaded? Which country has North Korea gone to? America has 800 bases around the world. America invades every country. In the morning, they get up, the American rulers say, now which country shall we invade today? But of course, they have overextended themselves, they overreached themselves. Everywhere they're distrusted. Their dollar hegemony is going to break because anybody who puts money in dollar reserves stands to lose it. They confiscate them. They're thieves. I mean, if I steal a bag of peanuts from a supermarket, I'll be prosecuted and put in jail for 6 months. These people steal hundreds of billions of dollars at a time. They have stolen even $300 billion from Russia's sovereign wealth fund, which was deposited with American financial institutions. And people have learned now, don't put your money in American bank. And even countries that have been flunkies for 60 years of America, like Saudi Arabia and the little state that's called the UAE, they're actually beginning to diversify their commerce as well as their financial dealings. So things are not going well for Uncle Sam. But of course, it's a very powerful country. It's on the decline. And because it's on the decline, it's very dangerous. So the world has to live with this dangerous enemy. But make no mistake, they will be defeated. Kim Il-sung never lost sight of the fact that in the end, Korea will be united and Korea will be free. He even said in his autobiography, With the Century, he said, it may take 300 years. He said, so what? It took India 200 years to achieve freedom from British colonialism. It took 300 years for the Indonesians to get their freedom. It took nearly 100 years for the Vietnamese. It might take a long time for the Koreans to achieve their unification and freedom, but they will, make no mistake about it. He had such firm belief in the final liberty and liberation of the Korean people and defeat of US imperialism. And that's what gave him the strength. That's what gave him the status that he had in world politics.
We have to probably end here. Do you want to make some concluding remarks, Joti, and then I have to cut this off?
Yeah, I was about to come to you for closing remarks, Caleb, but I just wanted to come back on what Harpal said there, that this reminder for those who get pulled in by the propaganda. Number one, this highlights again and again things we're learning today about how the US, the imperialists, are agreement incapable, right? They sign pieces of paper when they have to, but as soon as they feel able, they renege on every agreement they ever sign up to. So you can't trust them. They're bandits. The only language they understand is the language of force. And these people who claim to love democracy have spread carnage around the world, drowning the people's democratic will in blood in every corner of the world. Dad, you named some of them, but also Greece, Italy, Vietnam, obviously, Indonesia. Everywhere you look, you see revolutionary upsurges being crushed so brutally because the will of the people doesn't fit with the will of imperialism.
Great.